Welcome to this week's episode of the Project Liberal Show. I'm your host, Josh Eckel, one of the co-founders of Project Liberal. And today I am joined by probably one of my top three favorite journalists, Dylan Burns. Dylan Burns is a guy who's spent a lot of time in the last couple of years reporting on the situation in Ukraine after the war broke out in 2022. He runs a show on dylanburns.tv. Dylan, thanks for making time for me, and I know we're streaming live to your audience as well.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here. I got to say that you're definitely in my top three liberal-themed podcasts as well.
That's good. Okay, good. I'd say that's probably of like 5 or 6 that exist, so we'll say we made it high on the threshold. I appreciate you making time, man. I've obviously you and I've connected, our paths have crossed many times in the last couple of years, and I think you have done an amazing job of kind of cutting through the bullshit on what's going on in the war in Ukraine. And as you know, as well as I do, Russian propaganda, Russian misinformation is like seeping through our discourse at every level right now. And so I personally believe that the work you're doing is incredibly important and incredibly valuable. So that was actually the thing that I wanted to cover tonight. My hope was that maybe you and I could talk through a handful of like the myths that are floating around in the Ukraine space. I mean, if you're on Twitter anywhere, on social, these things are everywhere. And so I basically took the ones that I saw on Twitter and I wrote them all down. And I wanted to see if we could go through them.
Before we get into that, I wanted to say something quick because I understand that getting into debunking culture can get quite annoying to be like, oh, I'm going to debunk this, I'm going to debunk that, I'm going to debunk your mom, your dad, your grandma, I'm going to debunk everything. But it is a lot easier to spread feces on the wall than it is to clean it up. Yeah. It is much easier for me to just say a bunch of completely garbage, made-up numbers, right? Like that 40% of Project Liberal podcasts end with somebody saying something horribly bigoted. I could just throw that out there. And then you have to go like, okay, well, I went through all the episodes and I found that only 10% of the podcast end with something bigoted. Haha. Or you'd have to go through and find all these numbers, do that. And so it's a lot more effort to go through it and clean up the mess. But I will say that even though, of course, the misinformation it doesn't dominate in every conversation, there are elected leaders that even fall for it.
Yeah.
I've seen, for example, and I hate to go straight for the bottom of the barrel, but Marjorie Taylor Greene going on state TV saying that the Ukrainian government is harvesting the organs of babies to pay for the war effort. That is not only conspiracy theory, that is like old blood libel style, weird type of 1920s stuff. Like it's not the type of stuff you even hear with these conspiracy theories that get into the public facing sphere as much. Maybe like adrenochrome is like the closest I can think of that you sometimes hear of. There were 9 elected leaders in our government that voted against condemning the kidnapping of Ukrainian children.
Yeah.
That is pretty embarrassing. And I don't think that every single one of them is just paid by the Russians. I think that would be a simple solution. I do think even them, they doom scroll just like the rest of us. That they are no better human beings than the rest of us. They get their brain interceptors hooked on social media just like the rest of them, and it can hurt them. And even if they're in elected office, they can come to these failings too. So I do think for at least the most popular ones that spread around, there is some service at least addressing these questions, addressing like, hey, I heard about this before. Yeah. That doesn't mean you need to give more attention to these series necessarily, but once they've reached a certain point that you have to address them, you got to address them.
Yeah, and you're damn right. I mean, like it takes 2-3 seconds to lie on the internet, and it takes could take 2, 3, 4, 5 days, even more, to debunk that. And one of the things that I'd like to frame it, at least for my audience's side, is the lies that are permeated right now in society surrounding this issue. They're not just social media posts. I mean, these things, as you mentioned, affect legislation. They affect human lives on the ground. And so spending the time to come to understand what the truth of the situation is incredibly important now, especially on this issue. So yeah, I'm in. And I wanted to kick us off with the one that's the most timely, or at least start with that one, because I see this as likely going to be another escalation in the war. And this, to me, comes across as completely false intuitively. But I don't know if there's any facts on the ground that you want to share. So your audience knows this probably as well as ours does. There was a major terrorist attack in Moscow a couple of days ago. Actually, it was early last week. and what was the death count of over 170 people, I think, at last check that had died?
144.
140, okay. I think a lot of people early in that were looking at that and really concerned about what Putin was going to do to escalate. And obviously, the news has come out and said that the U.S. intelligence warned Putin about it in advance, and they didn't take necessary precautions. But the narrative that I've heard from Putin's mouth the day after was that this ISIS, now was established as an ISIS-K terrorist attack in Moscow, was the Ukrainians had given them a window to escape. And I'm curious as to what you've seen about this. How do you address this fact that's flying around that Ukraine was somehow involved?
We were talking about this earlier because there was an update to the story that broke today from unlikely third party. But there's two main angles to this that I've been trying to hit on the most. The first is who did it. And immediately once the attack happened, everybody started going out to establish the narrative. And I remember when I was speaking at LibertyCon, I talked about this briefly, is the idea that immediately once one of these attacks happen or some event happens, each government's going to release their footage or whatever they can to angle it towards their interests. And so you cannot come out, and the Ukrainian government says this, Russian government says this, you can't just take any government at face value unless they have sufficient evidence to back it up. Of course, you can judge some governments as less credible than others. Like if one government has a track record of lying consistently about something, you could say their word's probably worth less. If another country is really credible about something, say maybe as a third-party intermediary or some other thing, then maybe you could give them more credibility. But at the end of the day, if the two countries have interests involved, you cannot take either of them at face value. But something that really disturbed me online was just how much everybody else jumped on it, started throwing out theory after theory after theory after theory before the bodies were cold. But this happens with so many different terror attacks and horrific events that I feel like we're getting pretty numb to it. But I feel that we need to socially isolate the people that jump on these tragedies right when they happen and start saying, I heard this rumor, and then they cite their source and it's another link on Twitter. I don't want to call out anyone directly, Mario Newfall, but there are people who do that, and it's embarrassing. And those people came out and said, hey, look, this was actually a Chechen soldier. That person is currently in the Ukrainian armed forces on the front line fighting, so it'd be pretty crazy if he somehow made an escape over there, and they had to retract it later because they jumped on it so quick. So the first thing is, when these events happen, these attacks happen, wait. Just wait. Wait until all of the evidence settles. You will have some preconceived notion in your head about who you think probably did it, from the style of the attack, when it happened, the politics surrounding it. But we've seen ISIS-K embarrass conspiracy theorists back to back. First, it was the terror attack in Iran, and because of the war between Israel and Hamas, everybody took that attack and put it in their own preconceived notions of the geopolitical struggle that's happening right now and is most present in the media. But ISIS has attacked Iran again and again and again for like the last 10 years. And it's been horrific. It's been an awful thing for Iran. But it seems like for all these people who cared so much about that terror attack, they didn't know anything about that history. And then as more time passed, I think now it's pretty clear that it was an ISIS terror attack. In fact, one of the suspects related to the bombing, and this was the big story that came from today, told the Iranians that there was a plan to attack Russia. And that this plan to attack Russia, they then took this warning and gave it to the Russians. The same way the United States gave the warning to the Russians. What's interesting, though, and this is the big news from today, is they gave it to them from this interrogation evidence. But we went to them with evidence from intercommunications, like intercepted communications. It's the same way we found out that they were going to invade. We have really, really good signals intelligence. And so these are two separate pieces of evidence, two separate sources on two separate ends of the political spectrum on geopolitics. Different sides. The Iranians don't have good reason to be our friends. We are not. We are not their friends. We're not friendly countries. But we came to the same conclusion about this. And the reason we came to the same conclusion about this is because the evidence overwhelmingly points towards that. If you look at the people who did the attack, they're not professionals. If you look at how they're holding the rifle, it looks like they're trying to throw bullets at the people that they're shooting. And you don't see somebody jerk around a gun like this and like do that to try to throw a bullet at someone unless they've never shot a gun before, or they're like an untrained militiaman, or they're a terrorist. When you see that ISIS released footage, ISIS claims it through the Amaq news agency, the evidence at this point is pretty overwhelming. And to be quite blunt, this is the style ISIS does terror attacks. This had ISIS written all over it from how the terror attack was done. And so all the evidence points in that direction. There were two countries, one a Russian ally, one a non-Russian ally, that were fulfilling their duty in warning them about this. And so, to me, ISIS is the clear candidate number one by miles and bounds. If anyone says that it's likely it's anyone else, I think you could disregard them. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying we have yet to see any evidence. And of the cryptocurrency stuff the Russians have brought up, or any piece of evidence that they've brought up, they have yet to provide anything to substantiate it. Like, for example, when people talked about that ride to Ukraine, like they were trying to, I think Scott Ritter said they were returning to North or whatever. Originally, they had this picture of a van that they said was the Ukrainian van that they were using to transport back. It had Belarusian plates. They said it was Ukrainian plates. It was Belarusian. It's just people didn't know that, and so they assumed it was Ukrainian plates. And the Russians have yet to provide any evidence that they were returning to Ukraine. And of the cryptocurrency thing they said, which is that the Ukrainians paid them to do the attack, they have yet to show any of the wallet transactions. They have yet to show any of the stuff that anybody who knows anything about crypto would know that there's some record of when these types of transactions happen. So for me, that question's already kind of settled. But the second thing, and this is what I think the first question's all about in the first place, is to avoid the horrific scandal that this should be. This is an example of the Russian government being warned by two separate parties, one of which is an ally, one of which is not, that there was going to be a terror attack. One of those warnings even said the city that it would happen, and even said that it would happen it could happen somewhere like a concert hall, which is where it happened. These are pretty scary warnings, which the Russian government completely disregarded. Putin said 3 days before the attack that this was just meant to cause discontent within Russia. This was meant to hurt Russia. And so if you take the FSB and you concentrate them all in occupied Ukraine to arrest Ukrainian children tying yellow ribbons to trees, then there's going to be less of them to take on the real terror threats in Russia trying to do terror attacks. And there should be a real scandal here. But because it's being fingered at Ukraine and all the direction is being, oh, this is just part of the war, it's almost like it's a natural disaster. Now it's being treated like the Russian government, almost like there's nothing they could have done to prevent this, even though they were given warning. They could have concentrated on other real security risks to their nation state. And so I think that a lot of the first conversation is to blur the facts and evidence and on what is true, what isn't true enough, so that people don't get to the second point of the conversation once the first one would reach its natural conclusion. Now that we know who did it, who is at fault for it happening? And a lot of that blame would fall on the Russian government. I mean, just like we talked about that, I think it was the Uvalde shooting where the cops had the terrible response time. I believe it was Uvalde. We have so many.
Where they were waiting outside the school, and it was a national.
It was a national tragedy, and it was a scandal, and it was rightfully scandalous. An hour and 20 minutes was the response time from the Russian police to get there. The guys got away. In Uvalde's case, the guy was blockaded in the building. That's why they waited. In this case, they were running around shooting everyone, and then they got away, all four of them. There's a possibility they could have all gone away and then did another terror attack. Yeah. And then another terror, and like a spring of terror attacks because of the response time. This should be a scandal, but because the conversation is focused on, oh, this is just part of the war, so therefore it's not really in our control. It was the Ukrainians, it's the West that did this. You can't have the natural second conversation that the society should have if they want to stop something like this from happening again, which, for the love of God, we don't want to see something like this happen again.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Terrorism is never appropriate, against civilians. I think that was my takeaway from it was, well, at first when I saw what was happening, my assumption was that Putin was going to use it in some way to bolster the war effort. I mean, my assumption at the very beginning was he was going to blame some element of it on Ukraine. And it looks like due to the domestic failings of the Putin regime, That's a lot of egg on his face, right? I mean, that's really disturbing to see that many people fail or that many people pass away because of their failures to listen to intelligence from their allies. So has there been any evidence at all that Putin provided or that the Russian government provided that was at all compelling? I mean, you mentioned the cryptocurrency thing. You mentioned the plate. I think I've seen those things.
Yeah, the thing is, they'll say things, but then they won't provide the evidence. It's a good example would be like, you remember the chemical weapons that they said that Ukraine had these biological weapons. I think some stories would go as far to say that would target Russian DNA, right? It was they were these super weapons. It was like from the X-Men films or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they've never provided any physical evidence. Nothing. They just said that, yeah, I mean, they were there and they're doing the research, and then they just don't provide the evidence. And this reminds me of when Bucha happened. When the cars came in, the scene was horrific. I visited some of the people who lived there. I filmed it right before they started the rebuilding process. I visited the mass grave. It really was a horrific period in Ukrainian history. And the footage was getting spread everywhere of the people coming in and just the bodies strewn about. It was horrible. And so what the Russian state media did is they just showed the footage and then they just put the word fake on it, and that was it. They just put the word fake on it, and that was it. That was the state. Boom. They just said it was fake, therefore it was fake. And that was that. I know that Steve Rosenberg from the BBC was covering a lot of the press outlets, the newspapers, which are seen even less than the actual state media in the West. And in the newspapers, I heard commentary from George Galloway, which is a British MP of a very strange kind of schizophrenic variety, in my opinion. And he was providing evidence like Obama had a meeting 3 days before.
Okay.
And I thought that was particularly compelling.
Yeah.
Scott Ritter, Kid Diddler in Chief, he had a segment where on some radio program, he's somebody who does a lot of work for the Russians on state TV. He went to Chechnya recently and gave a speech to Kadyrov soldiers. I don't know if you saw that.
I did see that video.
It was bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely bizarre.
He said that when they did the Shahada, they used the wrong hand during the terror attack. When they had one hand with a gun mowing down people and they used one of the hands to perform the Shahada, they used the wrong one.
Smoking gun.
So, yeah, this is the problem. It's all coincidental evidence. It's stuff that makes you just go, huh, at most. And when ISIS is releasing the footage, when the Amaq news agency is claiming it, when Iran is pointing towards ISIS, when we're pointing towards ISIS, when ISIS is saying it was us, when it looks like ISIS, when it walks like ISIS, when it talks like ISIS, it's ISIS. At least that's my perspective. But these bodies are, in my opinion, are being disrespected, and they're not allowed to rest. Even in death, they are being made to serve the end of making more bodies in conquest. I think it's horribly tragic, and the only way to deal with this is to call it out as much as possible, but breaking that information bubble in Russia is extremely difficult.
Understood. Well, interesting to see, and I think that we haven't heard the end of this story, right? I mean, what's going to happen as a consequence of Putin's attempt to cover up his own domestic failings may still have yet to play out, because it seems like the story, as you mentioned, is still developing as we speak. So I am very concerned watching it. How do you feel about going to another one? Let's go to the next one on the list.
Sure.
Okay, I want to go to the one that I've heard a lot. Actually, this one's getting a little bit more dated now because he passed away. But Gonzalo Lira, the narrative I hear on Twitter all the time is that this American journalist was in Ukraine doing legitimate journalistic work and was murdered by the Ukrainian government because he published content that made them look bad. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a lot of stories there, or a lot of to unpack with his story. But I'm curious as to how you navigate that specific anecdote, and we can obviously talk through some of the nuance in the story because I'm pretty familiar with it as well.
So let me be blunt. He didn't like me, and I didn't like him. We were blocked. We already blocked each other. So I'm not the most unbiased person in the world. So I'll try to straight shoot it as much as possible and not let my bias show too much. But it will show because I never really respected him as like a journalist. I would call him a blogger more than a journalist. Okay. So Coach Red Pill is what he used to go by before, and he was a pickup artist, basically. to put it bluntly. He would tell you how to master women and like figure out like this is, you know, women are like dogs, and he was a really more, I would say, it's of a chauvinistic style. Now, I'm not a pickup artist. I don't know the sweet science of love, I guess, so you're gonna have to listen to him to figure out if he understands it better than I. Whatever it is, he eventually moves on and starts doing more politics news, and eventually moves over to Ukraine right before the invasion.
I was told
Now,
it was a day before Ukraine the invasion happened. He
I
arrived
don't
in
remember if it was a day, but it was right before.
Okay.
It was right. I don't remember the specific day, but it
And
was
he's
right
flying
before
from
the invasion.
He's flying from the U.S. at this time to basically say he wants to do journalistic work in Kyiv. When he arrives,
he's going to be a professional journalistic man. He's going to do journalism. So he goes to Ukraine, and he lives in Kharkiv, which is in eastern Ukraine, and it was a city that was bombed quite a lot. And to be quite frank, his journalistic work completely was comprised of staying in his apartment and going on Western alt media programs and talking about stuff that he read from press releases. Now, I'm not saying that that's even necessarily bad, because I work with people whose entire job it is to repackage like content from like they work for like wire services, and can be really backbreaking work. That's not what he's doing. He's not working for a wire service. He is taking press statements from the Russian government, reading them verbatim on his stream, and then reporting it as fact.
And in some cases, Dalen wasn't he also going on Russian state TV and state media to do some of this reporting? I mean, you mentioned all publications in the United States, but I also recall he had a couple appearances on Russian state TV.
Yes, he did have appearances on Russian state TV.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I've been talking to him for so long, I just kind of assumed that was a given.
No,
But no,
more
he
for
had
my
appearances on
audience.
Russian.
You're just framing it, yeah.
Yeah, Russian state TV and such. And I looked at his content, and it was just full of lies and holes, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it because I remember he said that the HIMARS was destroyed. Now, there are HIMARS that have been destroyed since, I think, 2 or 3 in the last 2 months, as in the first ones that were destroyed. He was saying in the first year of the war, there were multiple destroyed. And when you go and look at the evidence of it, some of it was quite literally video game footage. This is not journalism. He was accepting this at face value, then taking it and then reposting it on his content. Now, a lot of people read articles and then call it like, look, I'm doing a journalism. You're not. You're just reading somebody else's work. You can say you're a commentator, you're a blogger, you can say all these things. That man was not a journalist. If he went out to the front, took pictures, and was like, look, I took this original photograph of somebody fighting, that's journalism. I did this interview. This interview could be journalism. It might be instances he could find 1 or 2 interviews on his podcast that might actually amount to something resembling journalism if you could ask a good question on occasion. But he did not do journalism. He did commentary and blogging. To be clear, that's still protected by freedom of expression. That's still freedom of expression, but that's not journalism. There are people in Ukraine that are doing real journalistic work, exposing mistreatment of soldiers or volunteers, or exposing government pressuring of certain journalists, or exposing certain corruption stories. And these are people who legitimately are risking their professional reputation, risking their financial reputation. I mean, there have been journalists that have been assassinated by Ukrainian political elites if we go back like 20 years. And while that's 20 years ago isn't a lifetime. That's just like 20 years. And so there are people legitimately risking their lives as doing real journalism. And so I just don't want to amount this to the same thing, because it wasn't. Now, eventually, he keeps doing this commentary, and his commentary takes a more and more pro-Russian angle, to the point where he's basically egging on the Russians, cheering for him to take cities. He's putting up maps on Twitter that are like a split up map of Ukraine, of how the country is going to be divided once it's conquered by the Russians. And he's cheering them on and denying war crimes. Denying Bucha, for example, which he never was able to back up why he believed it was done by the Ukrainians. He was never able to back it up substantially. The longer it went on, he just ignored it. He just stopped talking about it because the evidence became too overwhelming. That's true for a lot of the people who said that about Bucha. Jackson Hinkle is another person who just doesn't talk about it anymore because the evidence now is just way too overwhelming. Eventually, this noise that he's making gets the attention of Ukrainian authorities. And so they send people out to him to tell him, hey, you are not allowed to deny atrocities that happened and to root on the Russians while you're in this country. You're not allowed to do it. Stop it. If you're going to keep doing it, leave the country or stop it. And then he didn't really change his behavior anymore. And then that is when Ukrainian authorities, and I heard, and I can tell you from personal experience, put whatever amount of credibility into this, from people who knew him directly, that this period he became very, very paranoid, peeking out his window, very scared about what was going to happen, but he didn't change his behavior. That's when the government then raided again, and then they actually booked him. And then after a period and stint in Ukrainian prison, he was released on bail. And while released on bail, because he was going to go on trial for the spreading of misinformation, there was stuff about taking pictures, but I haven't been able to find anything that substantiates that he was taking pictures and selling it to the Russians. People say that a lot. I haven't seen anything to that. There is stuff about him taking pictures, but that could mean necessarily anything. And until he was on trial, we probably weren't going to know the details of that.
Sure.
And now he's never going to go on trial. He gets released on bail. And then he decides that he's going to do a type of, escape from LA type escape out of Ukraine and try to cross the border into Hungary and claim political asylum. Problem is he's on bail.
Right.
So immediately when he tried to cross the border, they found him and it was like, you're on bail. And then he just went straight back into prison. Now, there's a few interesting things. You can go back and you can watch his stream. And I think this is the last time he's on camera as he's fleeing to the border. He live streams his attempt to flee the country and live tweets it. I have to say, not particularly intelligent if you're trying to flee the country to live tweet and live stream you're fleeing. Whatever. He does that. And he says that he was tortured in Ukrainian prison. He said specifically he didn't have any evidence, but he said he was tortured. He said that they took pins and that they put them in the whites of his eyes. Now, he didn't have any evidence of that, but he
now,
did say he didn't.
Where did he say this? Did he say this on like?
He said this when he was making his escape from his great escape.
Yeah. Okay.
The great escape failed. He was put back in prison, and then the last letter from him seemed to indicate that he had pneumonia or something of that sort. Now, this is where the speculation comes in. And so there's like two ways that people think of it. The first way is that the Ukrainian government killed him in prison. They tortured him, murdered him, and this is the most watered down version of it, that they created conditions that led to his death. Therefore, they mistreated him in some way, and therefore he died. Not because they directly like hit him over the head with a hammer, but because, he had not good conditions and it piled up.
They didn't take care of him. Yeah.
Yeah. The other angle of it, and this is what a lot more pro-Ukraine people say, or it just depends on how much you don't like him or not, really, I've seen, is that this person going into his 60s, who's a chain smoker and unvaccinated and a little obese.
Oh, and he's notoriously an anti-vaxxer,
and bragged
right?
about his vaccines making his sperm like more potent and powerful. I hope maybe that, is not healthy. And maybe that contributed to him catching pneumonia and then dying. And so it depends on what you believe or not. It's like with Navalny. If the Russians didn't kill Navalny, no one's going to believe him anyway. Because even if they didn't kill him or didn't purposely kill him or didn't create conditions that led to his death, and it literally was on accident, which they do allege, which we don't know, I don't believe, but I mean, it's possible because of the circumstances of his death and the fact that he's against the government and the government's record, no one's going to believe him. Now, the Ukrainian government doesn't have the same record of just like murdering prisoners or the same record that Putin does, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible for there to be mistreatment in Ukrainian custody. But as of right now, we have yet to have been provided any evidence of mistreatment. And so that is the full Gonzalo Lero story as I know it.
Understood. Makes sense. And the context, I do appreciate you playing devil's advocate on the let's say the pro-Ukraine position, because that's extremely important. All makes sense to me. Do you want to go to another one?
Sure, let's go to another one.
Let's move through it. All right, this is one that just happened recently. Russia just recently had their elections in which Vladimir Putin won by a landslide.
Did he?
Yeah, I was as surprised as you were, Dylan.
What a plucky underdog.
And the narrative I saw almost the week of was, Zelensky, and I think the Ukrainian elections would be happening around this time. I'm check.
We'd be gearing up for them.
Okay, yeah, so definitely check my work on that one. But the narrative that Russia is a more democratic country because Ukraine has suspended elections. Obviously, there's a state of martial law, and there's a lot of nuance to unpack there. But again, how do you address that whole anecdote?
Well, so I can talk about Russian elections first. Now, I'm not going to get into all the nuances of how exactly the Russians rigged the system because, like, a lot of it's kind of what you would expect. Ballot stuffing is pretty notorious. Keeping candidates off the ballot even after they've gotten the amount of signatures necessary. A great example of this would be Boris Nemtsov, which was an anti-war candidate from the Communist Party that was running this. Now, some people believe he's controlled opposition because he's from the Communist Party, which is typically aligned with the Russian state. Other people who, the Russian liberals or other Russians that back him more, see him as somebody who was taking a principled stance against the war and for political change to try to move Russia towards future, and he trying to like pick up the flag and keep going. But he got the amount of signatures necessary. And when I looked at the lines were long for him to get signatures. And it looked longer than any of the Putin lines that I saw personally. I mean, not that I personally saw, but the lines I saw online. Sure. But they just kept them off the ballot. They just invalidated the signatures and just said no. And whether it was because he was too anti-war and they didn't want that message getting out there, whether it was because they knew that if they had an opposition candidate that was actually semi-opposition and not just 2 or 3 other guys that say, we support everything that Putin support but are not Putin, then he might actually be able to get 10 or 15 or 20% of the vote or something, even if it's heavily rigged and controlled. And so they keep people off the ballot. They stuff the ballots. The Russian elections, even by its own people, when you ask them, many of them will come to the ultimate not realization, but will openly say, like, yeah, we understand that it's not completely free or fair, at the very least. Now, I would say that, to me, that's what I would classify as a rigged election. If you can't get a candidate on the ballot that's against the established norm, and the only other candidates that are allowed on the ballots are ones that support the established agenda, and then you stuff the ballots and just make it whatever result you want it to be, then I would call that a rigged election. Now, the last election that happened in Ukraine created an actual transfer of power. And I mean transfer of power of political rivals. Yeah. Petro Poroshenko over to Vladimir Zelensky. This election was monitored by international monitors, and they said, and these are respected international monitors, not just some and this is how the Russians actually will bring election monitors. They'll get people from neo-Nazi parties, crazy far-right people. They'll bring them over, call them the Election Foundation or whatever, and have them monitor elections in Crimea. But I swear to God, people can go look it up if they don't believe me. But in Ukraine, that was a real transfer of power between one democratically elected leader to the other that had real political differences. They handed over that power. That, to me, shows that it's at least in some capacity a democracy. That doesn't mean that it is a perfect democracy. I would talk about harassment of certain Ukrainian journalists. There was a scandal recently of cameras being placed in the hotel rooms of journalists, and then when they smoked pot and they had a party, then that was leaked out to make them look bad and uncredible, and to make their anti-corruption stories look less credible. And the office and the accounts that were posting that were associated with the Zelensky administration, whether that was tied with Zelensky directly or somebody else, who knows? These are real political scandals. But there is a free press that is allowed to function. I am allowed to talk about that, and if I wanted to, I could call Zelensky a pap smear or whatever I wanted to. I could call him those disgusting things in the world, and I can do that freely. And so that type of environment allows political opposition to form. The fact that Klitschko called Zelensky out directly and was saying that he was using, he's kind of, in some ways, I think he's being too up-down, too authoritarian in his running as a political opposition figure, as the mayor of Kiev, I think shows that type of political critique is allowed during wartime. And I think that shows the health of the political system with that political critique being allowed during wartime. But when it comes to the election specifically, Even though I could go and I could talk about like corruption issues and the hostile military administration and different things like that. When it comes to the elections, they have this thing in the Constitution where elections are not held during national emergency wartime scenarios, and that they wait until there's a period where the violence has stopped, the national emergency has passed, for them to resume elections. This is in the Constitution. This was put in the Constitution when the country was got its independence from the Soviet Union in the 90s. So I don't think this is a power grab by Zelensky. That doesn't mean that something like this could not be abused. Sure. But I do want to point something out. Ukraine was invaded in 2014. They had elections in 2019. So if the government administration wanted to use this to stop all elections and tighten their grip on power, that would have been a moment where they could do it. But they didn't, because they probably knew it wouldn't be accepted by... If they were brought into power by the Euromaidan pro-democracy movement, it's going to be pretty hard to say we got to cancel democracy permanently to that movement if they're the movement that helped bring you to power. Right. And whether it's just because of public pressure, the Ukrainian people not accepting it, they went through the transfer of power. They had an election even after the Russians annexed Crimea and took over 1/3 of Donetsk and Luhansk. And I think that we have good reason to believe that if the war was to end tomorrow, that they would return to elections probably momentarily. And I have no other reason to believe otherwise. It's not to say that something like this could never be abused. The people always need to keep an eye out. But this is something that was set up in the 90s. This isn't new.
Yeah. Well, and as you mentioned, Ukraine is not a perfect democracy, but there is no perfect democracy. Let's be honest, in that situation, there's more perfect democracies. But yeah, did you see some of those videos coming out of Russian polling booths with military? I guess they were Russian police just intimidating voters. I mean, how widespread is that? Do you think in Russia?
In Russia proper, I know less about it, but in occupied Ukraine, that is the standard. As in, if you're voting, there's a soldier. And the way it's done in occupied territory is they go to your house. And so they have like 2 or 4 soldiers holding rifles, come up to your house, knock on the door, and in between them is some collaborator, some person who's working with the occupied administration, and saying, we're here to help you vote. We're here to give you democracy and yada. And there have been ads played in occupied territory it makes my blood boil a little bit. And they're like, oh, we're here to bring the Ukrainian people democracy, and now you'll have a choice. There was this video where they captured some POW, and then they brought him to the booth and made him vote in this like beautiful political ad as if they were bringing democracy. But the way it works is they have 4 soldiers come to your house with one of the collaboration officials, and then they stand in front of you as you fill it out.
I saw photos of that.
In an area where there is executive power in Moscow for the government to seize your property at whim in occupied territories if you do not accept Russian citizenship. If that's the standard that they're applying by, and they get anything during this election season to indicate that you might be a problem, whether it be how you vote or how you interact in that voter interaction, that's something they're going to be thinking about. What's going to happen if I vote wrong here? What's going to happen if I tell them to fuck off? What's going to happen here? And so a lot of people just end up filling it out, writing Putin, handing them back, and just letting them walk off.
Understood. Okay, well, you touched on Euromaidan. You'll move to one more here. I think you and I discussed this one a bit when we were on the podcast last year, but I hear this one over and over and over again, and I always think it's an important thing to discuss. The Euromaidan in 2014, obviously massive, mostly young person-led uprisings at the time in Ukraine. I hear from Russia, from people that actually it's not even Russian apologists. I mean, I hear these from mainstream political candidates. I think I heard RFK say this the other day, that the Euromaidan.
Ron Johnson said this too on Zero Hedge in the Zero Hedge debate with Joe Walsh.
Who did?
Ron Johnson, Senator Ron Johnson.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's my point. I mean, we're hearing this from, it's basically a mainstream talking point in the Republican Party now, that it was a CIA-led coup in Ukraine to basically install a pro-Western leader. Curious how you react to that. Again, there's a big story there.
Man, I've been talking about this since I mean, like, since near the start. I mean, there's just no substantial evidence. I just did a piece with Lonerbox on John Mearsheimer, and we were talking about this, and people can go in there if they want to look at the money trail, because I followed the money trail, as in National Endowment of Democracy, as in the money that we've given, the money that is supposed to be the smoking gun. I followed it, and you'll be surprised that it wasn't bags of guns and tanks. It was, hey, this is how you train a election judge. Hey, this is how you train a voter monitor. Hey, this is like media literacy training. Hey, this is, some of it was border patrol. Some was anti-trafficking, like anti-trafficking funding for anti-trafficking of drugs and human trafficking, which is a massive issue in Eastern Europe. Definitely after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I find out it wasn't just us, it was also the Japanese and all these other countries. You can go check that out on that video if people want to follow the money trail. But the gist of it is what happened in Euromaidan is that the ruling leader, Yanukovych, won his previous election on the idea that he was going to enter the association agreement with the European Union. The association agreement was this deal that they had been negotiating with the European Union for a while, for years, that would allow them to do a bunch of things, would allow some free travel of certain merchandise, but very importantly for Ukrainians, work visas and visa-free travel. Visa-free travel would be very useful for a lot of Ukrainians as they try to integrate themselves more with Europe. The work visas be useful, and it was supposed to be seen as a really big economic help to Ukraine, as it has been a nation that, going into the collapse of the Soviet Union, Deutsche Bank was projecting it to be probably one of the most prosperous upcoming Soviet economies, to have setting the record for inflation of, I think, 10,200% during the peak, during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so they wanted to get out of this stagnation. There's no reason they can't have the same economic success Poland has. There's no reason. Definitely when you look at the demographics and the size of the populations, they should be able to. And so they wanted to enter it, and Yanukovych, even seen as the more pro-Russian candidate, and somebody who has like a background in organized crime, he would literally, back in the day, steal hats off the hat rack and run away when he was younger before getting into politics and moving his way up. That's also true about the person who heads the Crimean occupation and the occupation in Donetsk. And a lot of the organized crime is everywhere in the occupation. But Yanukovych agreed that he would do it because it was overwhelmingly popular and he wanted to win the election. And so then he won the election. But then it became time to actually sign the paper. And then the Russians, out of nowhere, started blocking trade with the Ukrainians on the border. And like 50% of all trade with a country that you're that economically intertwined with is a massive issue. And what did the Russians want? They want the Ukrainians to not agree to the association agreement. He wants them to not only pull out of it, but agree to a separate deal with the Russians to integrate them into their economic system, which the Ukrainians didn't want, and is the exact opposite of what Yanukovych promised, and goes against the Budapest Memorandum, which stated that Russia would not only not infringe upon the territorial integrity of Ukraine due to it giving up its nuclear arsenal to them, but also would not use tools, i.e., such as economic coercion, which is stated explicitly in the treaty, but was now being used. At this moment, the Budapest Memorandum, which the nukes had been given up for, in my view, had been solidly violated. There's some other moments you can go beforehand to find things where it's getting pushed and stuff, like in 2002 and other moments, but this is when it was completely, in my moment, torn up. And that's when Yanukovych backed down. But he chose to back down in the middle of the night to suppress dissent and to suppress people coming out. You announce bad things on a rainy day so protesters don't come out and protest against you. Problem was, protesters came out anyway. And they came out in the middle of the night, mostly young protesters. So they responded by sending in the Berkut riot police, which beat them with metal pipes, tied nails and screws to flashbangs and threw them into the crowd to basically function as almost like semi-shrapnel grenades. And they even ended up eventually, as the protest went on, killing people. Deeper into the protest, it would even be the heavily 100. Over 100 people would die. But once the country saw these images, they were horrified. And so they came out. And the Euromaidan wasn't just in Kiev, which blew up, but then also, there was the Automaidan, and then also expanded to Kharkiv. I know my friend Anastasia was a Euromaidan protester in Kharkiv. It spread to Dnipro. It spread to Zaporizhia. I knew another Euromaidan protester from Zaporizhia. It spread to all these cities, and after months of attempts to beat it down and quite literally shooting them, mowing some of the protesters down, and even an attempt near the end to outlaw groups of larger than 3 people. So it would have been an attempt to outlaw the act of protesting. The government felt the force on it was too much to bear, and after some attempts to make a deal fell apart, Yanukovych fled the country. Now, something that's brought up in this timeline is a conversation between Victoria Nuland, who is the former Undersecretary of State, and I think she just permanently retired from, I think, the diplomatic service, actually. So
yeah, I believe that was like last month or in the last couple of months.
Yeah, happy retirement. But she had a call with other American officials, and in this call, they discussed, and this is supposed to be the smoking gun, that it was actually a CIA coup. They discussed the future makeup of the Ukrainian government, which included people that did end up being in the Ukrainian government. The problem is it would be like, let me say you and me were Australian, and we're talking about who's going to be next president of America. Oh, I hope it's that Donald Trump guy, and then it's Donald Trump. Well, there was only like 2 likely options anyway. Even if I was completely wrong or missed the mark or whatever. Like, if there's a short list of the likely options, if you say one of them and they end up being it, you're not a fortune teller. It's just you had 2 options. You could have flipped a coin. Not necessarily, but you get the idea.
Yeah, and didn't at some point in that conversation, too, Nuland even push to include Yanukovych in the negotiations? And
this is the thing. This is the real kicker. Is if you listen to that and you listen to the whole thing and not just the clips that people put in their documentaries, they're talking about, hey, if we got to make this deal with the regime. We need to make a deal with Yanukovych because they were scared of Russian intervention. They were scared that if a deal wasn't made, then maybe the Russians would invade. Which, I mean, they wanted to make a deal, and then the protesters didn't make a deal. They didn't make a deal which they wanted. The West wanted them to negotiate with the Russians to make a deal, and they didn't. So in my mind, if it was a CIA coup, then that would have meant that they, at some point, just completely started ignoring the Langley's orders, if that was the case, because it doesn't seem to be in line with what this leaked phone call says. And that's a leaked phone call, so this isn't like diplomatic posturing. This was said in private, in confidence, under the understanding that it would never get out. So that leads me to believe that this was not a CIA operation. I think that all things considered, with the diplomatic, I would say the escalation management that both Obama and Biden engaged in, I think they'd be too scared to actually just do a full overthrow of the Ukrainian government. But I just haven't found any evidence, and I think the evidence points to the contrary. That's not to say that we didn't have any influence in Ukraine, but there's a big difference between funding an NGO that helps with, helps like Ukrainian blogs or helps train election judges or helps fund some Ukrainian media outlets and overthrowing the government in a CIA coup. There's very different there. If that's the case, then Trump's election was a Russian coup because they spread misinformation in the United States during an election. That would be hyperbolic. That would be silly for me to say that. People who say that he wasn't a legitimate president for those reasons, I think, are silly. But like that, you can't reduce this to that. And that's what this is an attempt to do in my mind.
Yeah, and then on top of that, too, I mean, it's not like this stuff operated in a vacuum. It's not like the West had influence in Ukraine before Euromaidan. I mean, Russia was doing the same thing on the other side. I mean, not only from trying to influence sentiment, but obviously we saw what happened after 2014 when with militants and, basically going in and doing a soft invasion of the country. So
I prefer election judges over bombs, but that's me.
Yeah. No, I think I'm in the same boat with you there, brother. Okay. Well, let's do 2 more before we run up to the hour. NATO expansion. It's one I have spent a ton of time talking about because, as you know, Dylan, I come from the libertarian space. The libertarians are very reflexively anti-NATO. I personally am pro-defensive alliances. I think they're very compliant with what would be considered a non-aggression principle framework for foreign policy. But one of the things I hear all the time is, Putin would have never done anything in Ukraine in 2014 or in 2022 if it wasn't for the fact that NATO was expanding and that he thought NATO was going to or eventually allow Ukraine in. Let's kick it off. I mean, any thoughts on that and how you assess that talking point?
So, we don't have too much time left, so I don't want to go into the whole principles of like Putin's history with NATO or NATO expansion specifically. I just want to talk about as a motivator for this invasion. I think there was so much more at play. I don't think it's impossible for this to have played some sort of a role. But when you listen to Vladimir Putin write his essays, or you read his essays, or you listen to his speech at the start of the war, he spends so much time talking about history. If you go listen to his speech with Tucker Carlson, and when Tucker Carlson gave him a blank canvas, he spent like an hour rambling about how history says Ukraine belongs to Russia. He writes an article before the invasion. History says that Ukraine belongs to Russia, that either Ukraine has to exist as an extension of Russia, or it has to exist as literally part of Russia, therefore annexed. Yeah. So it has to either be a direct Russia ally like a Belarus type state, or it has to be Russian. That's his ideological position. Putin's also 70 years old now. He's getting up there in age, and at the same time, the Ukrainian government is getting more competent. Its military has obviously gotten a lot more competent since 2014. I think that I think the ideological factor isn't taken into consideration as much. I think Putin wanting to establish his legacy isn't taken into consideration as much. And I think that there was economic factors. This whole crisis started again at the start, not because of NATO membership, but because of the EU. It had to do with EU economic integration that this whole war originally started. Yeah. And so I think that that's also a major factor as well. That's not to say that NATO expanding isn't no factor whatsoever. It's just that if that was the case, I feel like we should have gotten a more vitriolic response to Finland joining when they doubled NATO's border with Russia, or when Sweden joined, turning the Baltic Sea into NATO Lake. Yep. I think that there's just other factors that people don't want to take into consideration, either because they come from a neo-realist framework and therefore these type of domestic factors, like government types, they're not going to take into consideration as much, or because it's just simpler. It's just simpler to look at it all like a big chessboard, and they see these chess pieces moving forward and the Russians staying there scared of these chess pieces. But it's not that simple. That, again, it's not to say they didn't play any role, but Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO in 2022 than they were in 2014. Right. There had been no massive change on that front. The Russians, by annexing Crimea and holding 1/3 of Donetsk and Luhansk, had gotten themselves hard power that they could leverage to make really what any deal they wanted with the Ukrainians if they were to concede to giving some of that land back. Like, fine, you have to guarantee no NATO membership and we'll give you back Donetsk and Luhansk. Like, there's deals that they could have tried to pursue. They instead tried to pursue a full frontal push and take the capital, and that did not work, and that's where we are today.
Yeah, noted. And I mean, it is worth noting too. This quote gets thrown around all the time, but Gorbachev himself had referenced that NATO expansion was not a point of discussion in the early '90s, and I think you're right. I think the reason why this point sticks is so poignant is because it can really simplify everything to just one really quick anecdote. It's like, oh, it's West bad. Right? I mean, the West spread too far, and it's an obvious reaction, when in reality, the situation is far more nuanced than that. So, no, I think that's good commentary.
Yeah, it's not that NATO cannot at all look threatening from the Russian perspective, but I just want to throw out there that the Russians right now are the biggest advertisement for NATO that I've ever seen in my life.
And a defensive alliance is really only concerning if you have imperialist ambitions, when you really boil it down. I mean, if the idea that an independent sovereign nation is going to join NATO bothers you, then I think it speaks to the fact that you probably have ambitions to aggress on that country at some point.
The thing is, I think there are countries that can have grievances with NATO.
Sure.
I think the idea of one country attacking another country and then using NATO as a shield to defend itself.
Sure. Like
the Turks is a country that really worries me, because they have, I think they're very jingoistic at the moment, and I think they're being very aggressive with their foreign policy. Yep. There is real problems with NATO, but the Russian problem with NATO is that it's in the way of taking over Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, in my mind, at least from ideologically. Now, that isn't to say that everyone in the Russian elite wants that goal. But when you talk about what Putin believes on an ideological level in his writings, in his speeches, there is nothing dividing Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these three countries which are in NATO and Ukraine which isn't, from belonging to Russia, using the same foundation that he used to justify his attack on Ukraine. And that is something that is concerning to me.
Understood. Okay, well, let's, in the last 5 minutes, let's finish this off with the last one. This one is also very timely. The narrative I hear all the time online with this one is the U.S. the U.S. is effectively bankrupting itself by bankrolling Ukraine, and obviously there's a lot of nuance to unpack as it pertains to the amount of funding that we've given Ukraine and the type of funding, but military aid in general, and that when you hear that anecdote, the U.S. is basically going broke because we're funding the war in Ukraine. Your response to that?
I just don't see the math. And what really annoys me is it's the people who also have been doing the worst economic math forever. Sure. It's really annoying to see people who were very energetic to bankroll 20 years in Afghanistan, which cost us going on like $1 trillion, yep. Right? To see them flip, not because of, I think, of any deep, genuine ideological devotion to anything, but because the political winds in the Republican Party has shifted, and so now they're part of the populist isolationist rise, and so 800 billion to 1 trillion on this war, which we just, left and the country collapsed, that was worth it. 60 billion for this, with none of our soldiers dying and with large amounts of it being old military equipment that my grandfather used in Vietnam. I'm not kidding you. I've seen Vietnam era troop carriers on the front. I've seen World War II machine guns on the front. There are World War II artillery guns from our stockpiles that are in service in the Ukrainian army. Though we were never going to send Navy SEALs to go take out ISIS with World War II artillery. We're never going to use these weapons again. And so the first thing I want to say is a decent chunk of the weapons we've already sent were weapons we were never going to put into service anyway. Some of it on the edge of decommissioning. In fact, there are helicopters in Australia and I think Canada that they're going to decommission. And so the Ukrainians came up and said, hey, don't decommission them, give them to us. And that's how the Ukrainians are actually pursuing a lot of these weapons. When you go throughout a lot of Eastern Europe, the BMP-1s, the BMP-2s, these are older equipment that a lot of these countries are giving up under the expectations that they're going to replace them with new equipment. In fact, much of the money in the $60 billion that is allocated in the Senate compromise bill for Ukraine is replenishing of our own stockpiles. It's not even a sending of weapons over to Ukraine. It is the replenishing of our own stocks with, in many cases, better, more updated equipment. And this is all come together to come to $60 to $75 billion being sent to Ukraine, and a lot of it of equipment that we could never use anyway. So if somebody comes to me and says, like, what about homelessness? And I want to tackle homelessness too. I think we probably have a different model of how we both want to tackle this issue, but I think we both agree that you're not going to house the homeless with Bradleys.
Yeah,
you're not going to house the homeless with Vietnam troop carriers or these old mortars or cluster bombs that we're trying to decommission. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is we're talking about 0.3 to 0.5% of American GDP. We're talking about 5% of Pentagon spending. And the amount of... I don't know how people are going to measure the value of how this money is being used, but when it comes to the destroyed capacity of the enemy, that is happening. These weapons are being put to use to defend Ukrainian cities. They were put to use to help liberate parts of Kharkiv, used to liberate parts of Kherson, and have been used to sustain Ukrainian defense and wreak devastating casualties on the Russian enemy. And I don't say that as, like, yippee, all these people did. I say that as a weapons job is to defend your country against,
yes,
whatever threat it is. And the threat right now is invasion, and it has done destructive things to that invasion. And so we're talking about 40% of the Soviet tank arsenal obliterated.
Right.
We're talking about the Russian government going to Stalin-era tanks, yep, tanks that were designed and put into release during the Stalin era, not in backroom support or indirect artillery roles, but I've even seen a few of them being used in assault roles. That shows that, I think, compared to what we thought a war like this would cost us and be like, this is nothing compared to what we thought a war like this would cost us or be like compared to what before the invasion. And so I would also put forward that if the worst was to come about with this war, I am not of the opinion that we would just stick our tail between our legs and run, because our interests with Europe are so intertwined. They're our main export market. We're deeply culturally, economically, diplomatically entwined with them. And when we were attacked on 9/11, they came to our assistance. They're going to expect the same if they were attacked by either terrorists or they were attacked by a larger nation state. And if the Russians do take over Ukraine and they keep pushing, are we just going to say, okay, instead of sending the Ukrainians weapons, now we got to send more American troops to Europe to defend more pieces of borderland with the Russians in case they possibly cross the border, and to increase deterrence to make up for the lack of credibility that could have been established after we abandoned an ally we said we weren't going to abandon, if we were to abandon them and that was to be the outcome. So I think cost effectiveness wise, it's quite well. And also, I would say that there's no price in my mind in keeping up the nuclear non-proliferation goal, which is something I care a lot about. Making sure that not every country in the world feels like they have to race to get nukes to make themselves feel safe. If the lesson is sent that Ukraine gives up its nuclear arsenal, then gets invaded and conquered, and that was the 1-to-1, in the treaty that they said, okay, we're giving up these nukes, we won't get invaded and conquered, the countries that signed it invade and conquer them. I think that'd be a horrible, horrible message to send. And let me just say, the South Koreans, 70% of them are in favor of making their own nuclear weapon. 70% of South Koreans. There's real political support for this stuff. People think of these like far-off fantasies. It was a far-off fantasy for the Indians to get a nuke, then they got a nuke. It was a far-off fantasy for the Pakistanis to get a nuke, then they got a nuke. When Harry Truman probably did not think the Russians were going to get a nuke as fast as they did. If North Korea can make a nuke, do we really think the Ukrainians, after a bitter war where they had all these death pits, wouldn't, with their old Soviet scientists, many of them from, the nuclear age of the Soviet Union, wouldn't be able to finagle some sort of dirty bomb or nuclear weapon that they feel like could assert themselves, or other countries wouldn't? This is something that I feel like is not a cost that should be solely borne by the United States, but if there's a cost that needs to be borne to keep up that standard, I think it's worth bearing that cost.
That's actually an angle I haven't heard before, but I really do think the nuclear non-proliferation one is an important one. I mean, it's not only relevant towards countries like Ukraine after the conflict that could theoretically develop their own nuclear weapons, or countries far off, but it's also relevant in Europe, right? Because if they don't, as you mentioned, if they don't feel like they can rely on U.S. Support, then France is already doing this, right? And they're already thinking about what they need to do to step up, and you can bet that and
there's a real break in Washington-French relations over this, because they're not happy with what Macron's doing.
Right, absolutely. But I think that it's a natural consequence of this idea, and especially if the U.S. ends up fully abandoning their allies in Europe, that it will absolutely escalate that, because they're going to have to be more self-reliant, and then that could create more situations. I just want to say, if you could beat Russia and Ukraine, then you create an environment where peace is more likely in the long term. If Russia, I know you and I agree on this, but if Russia is able to just barrel over Ukraine, annex a country, then we're looking at another 20, 25 years of real problems. So, if not more. So, yeah, no, Dylan, we've got through my list. I appreciate it. I'm going to be able to cut this into a bunch of great segments for our audience, and I know that these are going to probably get widely shared. So, unless you've got anything for me that you want to discuss, I was going to give you some time to maybe do your plugs, at least for the sake of our audience, and then I'll close us out. So I appreciate it.
Sure, chat. Okay, chat. I want to ask Joshua one good question. So give me a good question, chat, while I do my plugs. My name's Dylan Burns. I'm a war journalist and streamer. You can catch my streams at Dylan Burns Live on YouTube or Dylan Burns TV on Twitch. You can catch my journalistic content either with articles on Offbeat Research, which I release stuff with them sometimes, or with my documentary, my films, which is where the majority of my work can be found, on Dylan Burns TV, my YouTube channel. I've released a documentary a month ago covering the artillery war in Ukraine. We embedded with artillery crews in Donetsk and with the counteroffensive down south, talking to them about their lives, what it's like living underground, psychological issues, recovering after the war, all sorts of things. I'm also going to be releasing a documentary in the next 2 months covering an embed that I did with an aid worker by the name of Dima, who helped save my friend John Jones when he was getting shelled by the Russians during an aid run. And he's a very interesting guy. He, as a freelance aid evacuation guy, completely working on his own, evacuated people from Mariupol, just taking trucks, just taking cars. Sometimes I even saw one video where he takes his phone out and he records. There's no tire on it. It's just scraping, sparks flying, brings it back. He's all smiles. He's a really wild guy, and I'm a very interesting guy, and I'm really excited to release a documentary on him. That's going to be the next 2 months on my main channel if people want to keep an eye out for that.
Awesome. I don't know if your chat's got anything for me, but I can also do a quick plug for the sake of our audience to close us out.
Sure.
So for those that are interested in learning more about Project Liberal, we're a super PAC. And without spending too much time on this, we were created because we saw an environment in the United States where extremism was basically on the rise on the far right and the far left. We see that most liberal Republicans, and by liberal I mean people that are fans of what traditionally liberal values that America was founded on, find themselves kind of isolated and left out of their own party. We saw the same thing increasingly, especially on the far left, after what we saw with October 7th, and it seems like there's a growing fracture between the far left and the liberal left, the center left. And so what we wanted to do was create a nonpartisan political PAC where we could unite people around one shared goal, which is promoting liberal ideas in American politics. And so, we started projectliberal.org for the sole purpose of doing that. We're about 4 or 5 months in, and we're always seeing a lot of growth. So if you want to learn more about Project Liberal, you can check us out at projectliberal.org and join there. Become a member, join our Discord. We have a lot of fun conversations in there, and I think we just hit 500 members, so it's growing real fast. Anything from your audience, Dylan, before we close this out?
Yeah, I got one question. Have you seen the movie or heard of the movie Hundreds of Beavers?
No. Should I check it out?
It's going to be, I saw it. It's an indie film.
Yep.
I just saw it. It was fantastic in Baltimore, in the Charles Theater in Baltimore. It's an old slapstick. It's like it's a slapstick film released in the modern era. And it was fantastic. It unironically was. It's going to be released on Amazon in 15 days. I heavily recommend it.
Okay.
It's like Blazing Saddles meets Tom and Jerry. It was very good.
That sounds very interesting. And I'm looking at the website right now. Very unique. Okay. Yeah, dude, I'll check it out.
There you go. I'm going to bombard you with my weird movie list, okay?
I will follow up with you when I see you again and let you know how it was. But I'm not really. I am a big fan of indie film, and it seems like we're reaching a golden era with a lot of independent creators where there's just a lot of unique stuff coming out. Not to spend too much time on it, Dylan, but dude, I'm excited to see what happens in the next couple months when AI video hits, right? And you start seeing creators, like real independent creators, empowered with global studio level technology. It's going to be horrifying for democracy, but very good for independent film and very good for content creators.
AI translation can be so helpful. Once AI translate, it's getting better and better and better. But just having translated words that like somebody who has a decent understanding of language can just quickly go through, that makes the process so much easier for me. Just telling like an AI to cut out all the dead air and stuff out of videos beforehand, just like stuff like that. It can make all the perfect thing for AI in my mind is just the AI takes out all the grunt work.
Yeah.
And leaves all the enjoyable creative work to the artists.
And going back to geopolitics, I could tell you that it hits different when you watch a foreign leader or somebody talking in your own language and it's dubbed with a mouth that looks like they're speaking English in their own accent. There's something about that I think is a psychologically different experience than watching a video and reading a translation. And I've seen this with, I think there was a video floating around with Macron when he did when he was talking about some of the stuff.
Yeah, I watched it.
Yeah, and it's just...
the one I saw really going around? I saw it on the Rogan podcast. They were getting this one of Hitler. They translated it, made him speak English.
Disturbing.
And they were like, yeah, it was disturbing. But then it was weird just seeing all the podcasts be like, whoa, okay, I get it now. I get why they all fell for him. It was weird.
That is interesting.
It is weird to listen to him speak in English, though. It is kind of haunting, honestly.
I believe it. I saw a couple with Milei, saw the one with Macron, but I haven't checked out the Hitler one yet. I should probably do that. That'll be an interesting experience. Educational experience.
Somebody clip that, chat. Somebody clip that.
Dangerous. Okay, well, Dylan, thank you again. We're past the hour, so I'll let you get back to your evening. Thank you to your audience and to your chat for listening into this. And projectliberal.org, dylanburns.tv. Have a wonderful evening, sir. I'm sure our paths will cross soon.